I'm just gonna present a little bit Transmixr because it might be a little blurry for some of you. So it is a European consortium of 22 organizations, of which Sparknews is a member. So we both work for Sparknews. The project, the Transmixr project, was launched to advance immersive technologies at a European level. So since 2022, all these actors have been collaborating to develop innovative tools for the media, creative, and cultural sectors. And we work with partners from the written press, television, museums, creative studios, and other professionals in these fields to accelerate the integration of these tools into their activities. And of course, we have also industrial partners such as technologies companies and university to accompany us developing these tools and evaluate them. So Sparknews is an impact-driven company with a mission to accelerate the ecological and social transformation of society. And so we are a French company and we play an advocacy and awareness-raising role in the Transmixr consortium to integrate DEI considerations into project development. And this led us to publish the Transmixr guide for DEI in generative and immersive technologies, and in which we provide conception, design, development teams, and professional users with a questioning grid to ensure that those considerations are present at all stages of a project. And you're invited to have a look at the guide on the Transmixr website. So this webinar is intended as a continuation of this awareness-raising work. So we focus specifically on extended reality, which should not undermine social cohesion and the common good, but we wish to explore how these technologies could even go further by actively promoting values of inclusion, diversity, and equity in their fields of application. And therefore, so we will explore the potential of these new technologies, as well as the warnings and barriers that go with it, with our two speakers that I'm going to introduce in a bit. And then we will start with a few questions and leave time for questions from the audience at the end. So to start, Juliette, thank you for joining us. You are a human factor engineer at Immersion, which is an organization that's part of the Transmixr project. So can you present your structure and your position first, and then tell us a little bit more about the role DEI plays in your daily missions?
Yes, sure. Thank you for having me, for organizing this webinar. So as you say, I work for Immersion. So it's a French SME, expert in immersive and collaborative technologies. We develop our own software, which is called Sharing. But we also participate in many European projects like Transmixr. We really think it helps to the development, and it's really important for us to work on these projects. So basically, I'm human factor engineer, but it can involve a lot of things. My mission is to take into account the needs of the users. It's a bit like UX designer. So I will study their needs first from like professional activities perspective, but also in their whole humanity, and to make sure we produce things that fits to them. So to do so, I apply user-centered design with a lot of methods. First, at the beginning of the project, with interviews, observations, and a lot of things like that. During the project, with iterative testing and user testing, which is really important. And also at the end, to keep track on the long term about their evolution and their habits with our tools. I studied human perception, human interface interaction, and yeah, I think that's all. We really try to apply human-centered approach, but in our daily developments. And for example, we recently added tags to our post-it in the software, sharing software, to make sure people can understand and prioritize in other ways than just colors. So yeah, I think that's all.
Thank you so much. And we'll come back to the approach and methods that you use in this human-centered kind of approach to development. Introducing now our second speaker, so Sarune. Thank you for being here. You are Associate Lecturer on Cognition and Perception at the University of Exeter, and interdisciplinary researcher on immersive education and accessibility. So can you tell us more about all of this, what you do, and how you came to work on DEI topics?
Sure. Hi, thanks for having me. So now I'm at the University of Exeter. My PhD was actually in psychology, where I worked on neurodiversity and virtual reality. So the psychology side was the neurodiversity, and then I had an industrial partnership, which incorporated a lot of XR work. Through that, I also got into the immersive education, so using XR for education, which sort of where a lot of my work seems to be going towards. As part towards sort of the end of my PhD, we also got together. I was at the time at the University of Glasgow in the UK. We put together some guidelines and a white paper, which was sponsored by Meta, and I led an accessibility work package for that. And also, again, my contributions were mostly the neurodiversity side, where my colleague, Lisette Chapernier, she sort of approached it from a more physical disability side of things. So as a psychologist, I've always sort of known quite a bit around different angles of accessibility. My expertise mostly are around neurodiversity, different aspects of neurodiversity, different types of cognition, different types of perception, whether it's diagnosed groups or just different cognitive traits and perceptual traits that we have. Sometimes the differences are just there, and we might need to think about that. And most recently, I started sort of talking a little bit more about my own neurodivergence. I've got OCD, which has never sort of been part of my research career, but I thought it's become quite important these days to talk a lot about the personal experiences, particularly of individuals who are in leadership positions. And I think that's quite been impactful when I teach my students around different cognitive aspects, perceptual differences, neurodiversity. It's quite important to share some of my own personal experiences, and that allows me to connect with students a little bit more and engage them with the materials a little bit more. So that's mostly kind of where my background is.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both for introducing yourselves. So we will start with a large question. So in your opinion, what role can immersive technologies play in the promotion of diversity and inclusion? And do you have any examples of ways in which it does so today? So feel free to start.
Okay, I can go. I think, first of all, to understand fully what people are living, it's like a live my life thing. We can try, and we have to try, I mean, to really understand and apprehend those issues. And so for the motricity kind of issues, we can try, for example, aging combination, wheelchairs and things like that. And until you try, you can think of it, but you cannot really understand it, I think. And for the visual and audio perception, I'm really thinking that XR and immersive technologies in general can help to alter the perception and to understand fully what people are living. Yeah, from this perspective.
I think that's a good point. I think there's a danger sometimes with the simulations of not representing overly stereotypical view of certain conditions. But I think there's sort of a double-edged sword with simulations or trying to demonstrate how someone perceives, or whether it's visual, auditory, or whatever other modalities. there's I think it's very valuable to share that information, and again with those who might have not experienced those sensations or different perceptual experiences. There is a danger. We've kind of talked a lot about this with my colleague who has visual impairment and works within this area. We worked on the white paper together. So for visual differences, auditory differences, which is just purely perceptual, it's very valuable because it allows others to understand the needs of those who maybe have slightly different experiences. But when you venture into the mental health and neurodevelopmental disorders, there's been a lot of discourse around the dangers of some of the simulations. There's a lot of interesting work around, say, demonstrating what schizophrenia or autism might look like. But there's a danger that it can be too overly stereotypically represented because those experiences can be quite varied. So I think that's sort of a bit of a challenge there, trying to balance where it's informative versus where maybe it's overly stereotypical in terms of the representations. But I think that's mostly related to mental health conditions more than any other type of experiences.
And yeah, because I was also reading about those types of virtual embodiment and its capacity to kind of widen perceptions and make people experience other realities. And it can be used as well for, experiencing kind of the position of a different ethnic origin or something like that. And for example, that some games were designed to make people go through a kind of journey, educative or something like that, as a Black person, for example, and see what ordeals that those people came up with on a daily basis. So I guess that follows the example of kind of widening perception. And within Transmixr, we develop immersive tools for a range of sectors, notably including the media, so television and print, cultural heritage institutions such as museums, and also the creative industries, and notably the performing arts. And we wanted to know, in your opinion, in what fields do you consider immersive technology as a real lever to promote diversity and inclusion? Maybe Sarune, since you work specifically in education, you can say a few words about this.
Yeah, I think education is, it's a nice, well, there's a lot of scope for it. I think, again, I'm always very sort of careful in terms of where the new technology is applied, because there is a danger with any new technology. And I think we've seen this with XR and we're seeing this with AI at the moment. There is this huge, the Gartner cycle, there's a huge increase in interest and everyone wants to use it for anything, whether it's appropriate or not. I think in XR, we're in a position where some of that hype's quite down a little bit. So I'm hoping that a lot of the users now are much more informed than they were maybe 5 years ago. But education is certainly something that I think it's where it has a powerful way to engage students, to allow, again, we're talking a new generation of students who have engaged with different types of technology. So they are eager to learn these about these tools, whether it's AI, XR, whatever it might be. And it's also increasingly important for their employability. So it's important for them to experience those, learn a little bit more about those. If there is a danger, I think, where we're trying to apply it too often. So certain topics XR is particularly good at. So you mentioned museum studies. I know it's been used extensively in trying to transport people into places they might not normally be able to go to. In STEM, teaching three-dimensional anatomy and things like that, it's very, very valuable. And there's just no argument against that. But there are certain then aspects where there is a debate around empathy training, or that's where it becomes, I think, a little bit murkier of like, what are we trying to teach? Are we actually training or teaching what we think we are? Or is it just some sort of a novelty effect that is always a counter argument for using extended reality for teaching? So I think now we're in a position where there's quite a lot of research in this area that we can start constructing a more sort of robust frameworks, hopefully, and considering the accessibility moving forward. But I think there still needs to, at least in education, it always needs to come back to the pedagogical goals. What are we teaching? Why are we teaching it? And just being a bit more mindful of why we choosing this technology, so it doesn't feel too much of a gimmick. It's actually there for a reason, because it actually enhances certain experiences, rather than there because it's a nice shiny toy that we can use.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I think we are at maybe a milestone where we, in order to make this technology improve and progress, we have to do a lot of research and apply them in a lot of fields, and maybe a bit too much fields. I think we are trying to put them in every situation, and I agree that it has to be there for a precise and appropriate purpose. But yeah, education is definitely one of those, and I feel like into the 3 use case of Transmixr, the media, culture, and maybe also arts, it can have a lot of different aspects, but also an educational one. So maybe education is the thing that gathers all the use cases, and the immersive technologies can be used for this purpose in the 3 of the use case. And also the performing arts makes me think to, we were talking about the sensibilization experiments. I think art can be a way to do it with a certain perspective, without saying this is the truth and this is the truth of anyone. So maybe it can solve also the issue we were talking about a bit earlier, about the stereotypes, and whether you do it in appropriate way or maybe too much, about the representation of, for example, mental health issues. Maybe art, for example, is a way to say, okay, I can take a different perspective and sensibilize in other ways. And from immersion perspective, we're working on the media use case, and from our side, we try to make it as much accessible as we could. For example, we have a Mixer version, but also a web one, because we are conscious that anyone cannot access immersive technologies. And yeah, we also try to have multimodal sensor realities with visual and audio parts. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for all those opportunities for technology to be more accessible, but also, as we know, some barriers might prevent extended reality tools from being seen as drivers of diversity and inclusion. In particular, when we think accessibility in the broad sense, we can think of economic barriers, digital illiteracy, or even resistance just to adopting these tools from like the population. And all this might limit the impact of those new technologies and the tools that can help accessibility. So what do you think of those barriers?
Well, I think the economic barrier is always one of the key challenges that we consider. But I think, again, there's, now that we have worked with XR for quite some time, it's been around the more accessible headsets now. We've got cheaper ones, and you've got multiple generations of those, which doesn't mean that the previous ones are obsolete, but they can be repurposed. So I think we're moving into that direction where a lot of the resources can be shared with, again, I'm thinking from more the sort of educational institutions. So if you want to use the technology, it's much cheaper than it was about 3 or 5 years ago. it also, there's ability for researchers and teachers to share the resources more than there was a few years ago. So again, it's just the fact that we're talking about 3 to 5 years ago rather than 20 years ago just shows how quickly the technology is adapting to these challenges. I think some of the sort of stereotypical representations I did talk about, there's the danger there, but I think, again, it's just making sure that the right people are involved in the discussion. So making sure that people who are, if you are representing a specific condition, you have a person with that condition helping out. But I think technical literacy seems to be, I think, probably still one of the more, the barriers are more harder to tackle, I guess, because I think it comes from different, there's different aspects. There's the resistance to change, of course, which is always hard for everyone. But I think there's a lot of, there's still, we're experiencing some of generational gaps. At least I see that in educational fields where an uptake might not, depending on the field, depending on the lesson, it might be harder. And with technical literacy for students, I think it's because it is more engaging, it's much easier, but there's an increased cognitive load and effort on the teacher, which sometimes becomes a large barrier, because creating new lessons, creating new tools, being really thinking outside the box, so how this information is presented to students alongside standard lessons, that can be quite really challenging for teachers, whether they use technology or not. And then on top of that, trying to maintain this technology, troubleshooting it, that's a huge pressure on the instructors to address.
Okay, there are a lot of social acceptance issues in general. You said from the teacher perspective, but maybe also from the student, there's one, because I feel people are overwhelmed by a lot of information, and they just sometimes don't want to put this again, a new tool, a new screen, was a very big one because of the technology's improvement. It has improved a lot, but it's still cumbersome, it's still big. You have to interact with controllers, which is not always very convenient, even if you can also interact with the hands. So yeah, there is this aspect of, I feel from our customers that people don't necessarily want to have this interface, one more interface, one more screen. It's really a supplementary workload to them to change their habit, but also to have another tool. And also, I was thinking of maybe the fear of being ridiculous, if you put that, because you cannot see directly the eyes of the other people interacting with you. So I feel like, especially for important people or high worker, they don't want to put it, or they are a bit shy while interacting with the objects because they don't want to, I feel it like this, don't want to be ridiculous or bend or do things, because you're basically interacting with like this, doing things that nobody can see. And so I think this is another social issue, maybe, to accept those technologies, and maybe one another barrier.
Mm. And you were talking when we talked previously, Juliette, also about the kind of people's desire for more human connection, and this isn't the kind of tools that help connecting deeply and genuinely with humans, and maybe people are kind of want to develop more genuine and basic human connections, right?
It's like Sarune said just before, we have, I think, to find the right purpose, the topic where people would say, okay, I need to use this at one particular moment, but we cannot just put this like with a lot of other tools, like an overlay, and say, okay, you have to use this because if they can use, I don't know, paper and pens instead, they will, because it's less efforts. It's also, yeah, less demanding.
And also, Juliette, regarding digital literacy, do you maybe, like, when you work on a specific tools, do you work with like older people? Is it harder to work with them, or to like make them use the tools in general? Like, do you feel like it's a big barriers when you work with clients for immersion, for example, like even when you test the tools with people?
We usually develop tools and software for the not for the elder people, but for workers. So we have kind of a short range of ages. I mean, but maybe we feel a difference between maybe around 45 or 50 years old with the interaction, because before people are mainly using with test and tries things. They either be success or not, but they are not afraid to try a lot. Maybe up to a certain age, they are a bit less daring about this. They will just first watch and then interact. So maybe it's this difference I can think of, but we do not work with the youngest and the elderest people. So I don't have many examples about this, but obviously we have to consider this population, and I think they have different issues and needs than the traditional worker range.
Yeah, I think sometimes even the age is not so much of an issue in cases. I think you can have younger students that I've encountered that might just not necessarily engage with technology so much, regardless of how strange it might seem these days. They might not necessarily find it intuitive enough. So I think it's just almost individual differences. And I wonder if it's maybe having an alternative always is the best answer, because XR, although I love using it, it doesn't, still comes with certain barriers, like the cyber sickness being the most sort of still misunderstood one. And occasionally you'll have one or two individuals who just don't want to engage with it. So I think it's just always being prepared for that alternative, not relying on it 100%, but not, again, depending what you're doing, but I think normally that solves some of that technical literacy challenges if you offer some alternatives or ways to incorporate XR. So it's not just only XR lesson or XR experience. It's alongside something else that they can do if they choose not to engage with it.
To have an opportunity is, I think, necessary, and also to maybe one of the leverage to the use and getting used to it, it's to include it fully in the workload and in the habits of people with other tools. And for now, maybe it's a bit either you're using XR, either you're not, but it's not fully in continuity with your daily work, daily life. So maybe it's one thing to improve in the years to come.
Yeah, it's interesting because we don't necessarily realize that being truly inclusive in developing those tools is also maybe not imposing them on people, and accepting that some people might be reluctant to using them. So I think it's very important to put words on this as well. And going back a little bit to some of the topics that we address in our guide, we identified a number of questions that we think it's important to ask oneself when developing technological tools, to make sure that they serve an inclusive purpose. And so this includes, and you were talking about it, Sarune, this includes testing with concerned populations, making sure that in the development process, the people that we want to if we, for example, do a neurodiverse simulation, that we have neurodiverse people in the team, which seems obvious, but might not always be the case. We also mention checking unconscious biases. So maybe it would be interesting if you can share what, in your opinion, are kind of the key criteria to have in mind to ensure that immersive tech promotes inclusive values and is really accessible. And maybe there are some methods or reflexes that you have or examples that you can give us to show how to ensure this.
Yeah, I can jump in. So I think there's a few things in terms of the question. So I think to kind of build on things that we talked about, certain users might not want to, well, certain participants might not want to use the technology is something that I did start thinking about most recently, because I think with AI sort of growing in popularity, there seems to be a growing number of individuals who don't seem to be developing this reluctance towards technology, mostly on ethical grounds rather than anything else. I think it's mostly predominantly AI related rather than anything else. But I think it sometimes trickles down into XR as well. So perhaps something to keep, just dawned on me that it might be quite an interesting thing to keep an eye out in the future, because it seems to be something that's developing. In terms of unconscious bias, I think the importance is continuously being reflective of your practice. So so I work with neurodiversity, XR, inclusivity, pretty much every day I think about these topics. But even if you do that, certain things, it just slips your mind. And an example of this was, I like to share this a lot with whenever I talk about accessibility, that even if you work within the field, it doesn't exclude you from sometimes slipping up and then adjusting your assumptions and then just continuously reflecting. So a few years ago, I was teaching a summer school where we used the virtual reality just to demonstrate the capabilities of it. And I was setting up the headsets in mostly standing mode, which you would for most of the demonstrations. And even though I knew I had a student that is in a wheelchair, I just completely didn't even, it didn't seem to cross my mind, because every day, again, you don't use XR every day necessarily as often, but when you do, it's always nice standalone demonstration most of the time. I mean, resetting it for a seating position is not that hard, and it's an easy thing to do, and it doesn't affect student experiences whatsoever. But it's one of those examples that I continuously remember, because it's just shows that you might be working in the field actively thinking about these topics every day, and you still can forget ask the right questions at the right time. So I think one of the more important things for developers, instructors, or users is to continuously engage in this reflection and maybe stay humble as well, because we don't always know everything.
Thank you.
I totally agree with that. I think we have first to be trained on the cognitive bias, diversity and inclusivity, equality topics. As a designer, you have to take all of this into account, but then your own habits, life, and that comes in front every time. So that's why you need to engage the end users as many times as possible, not just at the beginning, not just at the end, but in the whole production process. This is very important. And yeah, to keep open mind to challenge and question your productions, to make them improve and be as accessible as possible. But maybe also one thing that struck me when I read your guide is to have a diverse design team. I mean, we can be trained, but to try not only to challenge with the end users, but to try to integrate give diversity in the design team. This is interesting, and I think we have to improve all this in that field. It's not always easy, I mean, to find the good people, but maybe with the end users design approach to include them in other ways than just testing, maybe.
So do you talk more with the end users during your testing phase and your evaluation, or do you also use some guidelines or like some resources when you're like checking your unconscious biases, or like being sure that you think about like everyone in general?
We do both. We have guidelines on the one hand, but also we challenge our production with end users. But I think one of the main difficulties working with XR is that we have many guidelines for web design, for traditional tool designs, like Bastien Escapin, a lot of heuristics, which are very interesting and can sometimes be applied in XR, but we are at the very beginning of XR and immersive technologies design, I think. So we have to find new guidelines. I know that a lot of headsets producer have published guidelines, for example, Apple with spatial media. There are a lot of interesting things, but for now we don't have a consensus or a big main guidelines, I would say. So we have to collect them. We have to challenge them every time too, because it's the beginning and a work in progress.
That's a very common issue, this sort of lack of guidelines, frameworks, wherever you really go. We have encountered this when we were putting together recommendations of accessibility for education, let alone any other area. And I think this is a challenge that I've seen in this area at XR research, education, whatever it might be, on again and again and again, because there's so much exciting work and there's a lot of interesting work, but it's spread across a lot of different disciplines. So it ends up being siloed in individual areas. And it's almost sometimes feels an impossible task trying to collate all of this or somehow make it unified, because there's, at the moment, for example, we're trying to put together a efficacy testing framework for how maybe XR is useful for education, how we test that. And even looking at what's available already, there's so many frameworks from different perspectives, maybe from different disciplines. So even if we're trying to make our own, it's kind of almost feels, are we just doing more of the siloed work? What can we do to have everything more unified? And I don't know whether it's because we're still, although there's quite a lot of work has been taking place on XR, I wonder if it's still fairly early stages to have some sort of a unified idea, guidelines, frameworks for this work. But I think it's certainly one of the biggest challenges across the XR work, regardless of which discipline you're thinking about.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's really important to think about the framework around DEI, but also about the environment in general of like organizations, companies, and people who's working on developing these tools, and the professional users as well. As you know, and we've looked in France because we were a French company, so we had those data that in France, the women make up 30% of the digital workforce, and only 18% hold positions in development and management. So the sector lacked diversity due to the systemic issues that's rooted in education, as well as the stereotypes perpetuated by the geek culture, the environment that is mainly masculine in technologies in general. And the situation is similar for people of color who face additional barriers to employment, and that ultimately reinforce biases in emerging technologies, and goes for other a lot of issues and also diversity in the sectors, was if you saw that fostering an inclusive and open work environment from the beginning as a prerequisite for developing tools that truly serve inclusive purposes. And also, would you consider that the tech sector to be more inclusive today? And is it becoming also more inclusive with time? Like, how do you see this evolution in the tech sector?
I think it's getting more inclusive and maybe less gendered, those kind of fields. For example, maybe it was because my engineer school was it was about cognitive technologies. So maybe we had human and technology at the same time. So maybe why, but we had maybe more than the majority of women. And a lot of them went into the developer sector. So I think it's getting better. I think we had some classes about universal design and cognitive bias and human perception. So maybe it's because of my school, especially, but I think it's improving. Maybe not as fast as it would need to, but it's improving. I think people have that in mind more and more, and we have to continue the efforts. But maybe too in the, we were talking about user testing and all of that, maybe to find new way to reach those people and population that maybe we don't have in the design team or in our surroundings. Maybe through XR, maybe with just video call. I think we had a vision of user testing, which is pretty locally, and maybe we can open up to reach other population and diversity.
Yeah, I think I agree with the fact that it's getting better. I mean, I'm in academia, so I think it's slightly varied experiences depending on the area, on the field. My main concern is that I think we do have on average probably more women than before in the area. My big concern with a lot of things around academia, at least, but I'm sure there might be a similar trend in the industry, that the leadership positions are still mostly men or quite homogeneous groups and representations. So I think that's something that perhaps will change with time, because if women are going into the technology fields, you don't become a leader overnight. It takes some time. I think in the future, what I would like to see is perhaps tackling some of those systemic biases and issues from early on. I think that a lot of schools and institutions will start doing that now, but trying to engage younger children and girls specifically, that trying to reduce that bias that, science is for boys and not for girls, which I think again is changing, but it needs to start much earlier than sort of the higher education. Because we've in psychology we teach statistics. In some cases it involves coding and writing programs, and gender or any type of diversity doesn't come into play here. Of some people are just better at this and enjoy it, some not so much. But I think I still see some of that lingering stereotypical ideas of if you're a programmer, it's very unusual to see a girl doing that, which I think needs to change much earlier before we get to the higher education.
So, and besides, it's not enough, I think, to just apply the DEI guidelines, something like that. We have to change the mentalities from deep down and to be aware of that from maybe childhood, and to make it more natural and more, put in everyday life.
And I think two things come back to me that we addressed in our previous discussions, notably Sarune. One of them was that not only should the teams be diverse, but that there should be a real space for open discussion, and so that everyone must be able to also share their voices and opinions in all stages of development, because if not, you might be in a team where you don't feel legitimate and it doesn't really bring the topic forward, right? And then the second thing, I think you were saying that bringing also more technology in schools at a young age can also make young girls more at ease with using those tools, and therefore encourage them to then go into these sectors later. I don't know if you want to develop on any of those.
I think the exposure to technology again is important. So like I said, where we, for example, when we worked with, well, in psychology, we mostly start off with mostly women, and then it changes, the ratio changes as you move into lecturers and then professors. But it was nice to see when you start teaching statistics, some people will hate it, and of course they don't like it, but the ones that do, and they start engaging with maybe using our programming to get through this, some of them really enjoy this empowerment moment where they almost feel like a little hackers, that they almost picture it as something unattainable or something really hard to do. And I think, again, it's just that stereotype that's been built up from years and years of certain, what do we see represented in the media in leadership positions? And I think it's slowly changing with women being represented in technology. But again, we need to do much more of that, I think. And including technology, even, again, we don't have to teach every class in XR. Even if we include some of the new technology, it's XR, AI, whatever it might be, just showing that as an option or potential way to explore it as a future career, that is enough. So just really broadening their world and their understanding.
And our final question, and we've already addressed some of them along the discussion, but we wanted to talk about obstacles and blind spots that might still exist in the sector, and that we should look out for when working and developing and promoting immersive tools regarding diversity and inclusion topics. Maybe there are some warnings of points of particular vigilance that we should have that you'd like to share, notably in a context, as we know, of the kind of rapid and maybe unchecked development of such tools?
The first that comes to my mind is that I think we don't have to reproduce the reality. First of all, because of technical issues, it's very difficult because of the uncanny valley and all those things we know about. I think it's a bit pointless to just reproduce the reality. People need real life. We won't have to use things to reproduce exactly the reality, but we have to find maybe different metaphors, maybe different way of interacting, maybe, XR superpowers that would enhance their interaction in a meaningful way. And this is maybe my warning. Just don't reproduce the reality, but think further. And it's very difficult because what we know is the real life. So we obviously want to reproduce it to make as real as possible, but I'm not sure it's a good way and the good direction to explore.
I agree with that. And I think to add on something we already talked about is in terms of going back to the working environment and how building a product or constructing a lesson, what that entails, is just not always thinking top-down processes of making certain decisions or where the questions might arise, is also thinking bottom-up. So not to say that developers are at the bottom, but it's often sort of at that point where developers start working on things, and we sometimes do have neurodivergent developers. At that point, the decisions have already been made, and a lot of the developers are actually end users or represent a lot of the end users' demographics. So I think it's just allowing for some of those top-down influences to be evened out with, bottom-up ones to be evened out with top-down. And I think it's quite a nice analogy because we've seen this happen in research, because in research it's always the researchers being the idea generators testing their assumptions and hypotheses. But the reason why neurodiversity and neurodivergence movement became such a huge influence and it was so impactful is because we had participants or individuals who have lived experiences speak up and share their experiences, and that influenced it from, again, the sort of bottom up almost process where it's not just this theory hypothesis testing driven approach. It's also trying to meet it in the middle from these end users, participants, lived experiences, whatever it might be. So it's not just dictated by a few at the leadership position. I think there needs to be, again, reflected on and questioned at each individual level. Sometimes I know in the real world, maybe it's not always cost effective, but I think it's probably important in the long run to ensure that those concerns are addressed and people are not afraid of to raise those concerns.
I feel like it's a bit like tea. You have to infuse to be good. And so about the design team and all the people producing technologies, I feel we have to get in touch with the diversity, with the population in a repeated so that it can become natural. Maybe XR can help with that, as we said at the very beginning, to fully apprehend and understand some perceptions. And while we leave it, we can fully integrate it in our design processes. It's maybe not enough to just get in touch with end users at some key points, that's necessary, but maybe not enough. And we have to fully integrate it in our way of thinking. It goes with the changing of mentalities and so on. Yeah, we live it and feel it in the deep down.
And maybe as a final remark, and something we discussed a little bit in our previous discussions, but there might be, and we already started talking about it, but there might be a general belief, and especially because you work in those fields, that XR or technological tools in general might be kind of the magic solution to everything. But we were also saying that it should maybe not be applied everywhere automatically to every single field and sector. So I don't know if you have any ending remarks on this.
You said it. Right. I agree with that. I'm not sure I have anything specifically to add on this, but yeah, I think to do things with a purpose and in a meaningful way, it's the most important, I mean, but not only for XR, for everything.
Yeah.
It's always just being reflective and not being afraid to ask the questions, because sometimes those questions might be uncomfortable, but we need to ask them. And we need to create an environment where you can ask those questions. So again, it comes back to this reflection, mindful use. Yeah.
These discussions and yeah.
Thank you so much for engaging in this discussion. It was really interesting. I hope the audience thought so too. We're going to leave some time, so we have half an hour left for Q&A from participants. And I see one first question in the chat. Someone asking, how early in the design or development process of a XR experience should we consider accessibility? Is it from the very beginning?
I think so. I think so. From the very beginning, you have to ask yourself which end users you want to target, which accessibility and maybe you will come back on that later. Maybe it will change, but I think it's a very necessary to ask those questions at the very beginning of the project.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think when we were working through the white paper for accessibility guidelines, we were looking at all the existing guidelines that are available. And I think Juliette mentioned that there are some headsets to release some of the accessibility guidelines, but a lot of them seem to be adapted from web page development or other games. And although it's great that people are thinking about accessibility guidelines, sort of repurposing the existing ones where it's a game or a website feels almost as an afterthought rather than something that's developed from the start. And when we discussed a lot of experiences with my colleague, when we talked about accessibility recommendations, we felt that sometimes for a long time, I mean, it's hopefully changing now, but for a long time, accessibility is almost an afterthought. So it works as a checklist that you do at the end, which I think is really a backwards way of going about it. So it needs to be from the get-go, because if you do it only at the end as a checklist, you will miss some crucial things that at that point is too late to change. And you might miss the entire demographic and exclude a group of people completely. So like Juliette said, it just needs to be from a very beginning and perhaps not reliant on repurposed checklists, not to hate on them, but maybe trying to always question what's appropriate.
If you do it only at the end, you will, it's like you would have to go back on some of them and maybe it will be a loss of time. I would say at the beginning, you can answer this question and then you can have your own guidelines regarding to the needs of your project. And like a checklist, you can apply within all the production steps. And yes, like that you will avoid to use too many times. And also maybe it can help you to find your end users depending the accessibility you target.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat. She's asking, what are the biggest barriers to widespread adoption of DEI tools? So I think it might be for organizations thinking that they won't benefit maybe from those DEI tools in general, maybe because of a cultural barriers, or I don't know, the lack of maybe benefits from them. What do you think?
Well, I think it's the sort of almost just the biggest issue is a misconception when it comes to DI or EDI or whichever acronym you choose to use. I think sometimes it's just misunderstanding of what it is. And then, so when you are considering diverse needs and diverse experiences, I think it just makes you a better user, better designer, better instructor. It's not to say that you're always considering diagnosed groups or gender or race differences. It's sometimes just a general diverse minds, and that's also fine to consider. But most of the good and well-informed DI adaptations, whether it's the design or instructions, I think makes overall experience better. So it's not just sort of targeted at that one group. I think everyone ends up benefiting from it because normally the experience ends up being much more streamlined, much more considered. And just, I think it just improves the work overall. So even if someone is reluctant to consider DI or EDI, again, in the current political climate, it's not about kind of all this controversy. It's about just making everyone's life easier. And then I think it's just tackling some of those misconceptions of that can be the biggest challenge probably, when you get people talking and appreciating what you're trying to do when you discuss DEI or EDI. I think that's pretty much the battle won at that stage. I think it's just the reluctance and misconceptions that's the biggest issue.
Yeah. I also think it's a barrier if you consider it like a tool, because you will have to think to use it among a lot of other tools. So it's likely that you will forget it, or just in a rush, you don't think of it. So I think if you only consider it as a tool, it's a barrier in the use of it. But if you really think of changing mentalities and getting used to it, as you said, Sarune, in your mindset, I think this is where it becomes efficient. And yeah.
And Philippa was also asking if you have advice for someone looking to specialize in developing and implementing immersive tools for social good. Specific advice for this.
I think, again, it's just being mindful of the concerns. Sometimes that's the biggest battle. So even if you're working in the area of trying to around inclusivity, regardless of which one you're thinking, or accessibility, I think it's just being mindful of the criticism. So I think you need to be aware of the both sides of the argument to make sure that yours is well informed. And yeah, I'm not sure whether I have a better answer to that other than just being mindful. It's quite a difficult question to answer, I think. It's yeah.
I'm not sure, but maybe yeah, also to try to think to the experience in its globality and not just through one XR device, because it will evolve at some point. And yeah, to think immersive in the globality, not with one tool or device, and to integrate it, as we said, to the whole daily life or work, depending on your use cases, but to make it fully integrated to the uses and habits. And maybe what we said about thinking further of the just reproducing the real life, trying to enhance all the life experience with this, but as a constraint, but as a natural interaction. Yeah, and also maybe I was thinking, because of the adoption of DEI, maybe to think that maybe you're not in a position of impairment at some point, but you can be, for example, momentaneously, if you become, just if you broke your foot, for example, I don't know. But so, yeah, maybe thinking of not just one category of people, but about all people that can be affected at some point at their life. Yeah, would be my answer.
Thank you. I think
there's one in the Q&A section. There are two different spots, but Amit is asking, how can XR researchers foster inclusive participation by addressing participants' self-assessed accessibility barriers? I don't know if that's clear enough.
I think so. I think if I'm understanding this right, it's just self-assessed accessibility bias. I think it's just whenever it comes to participants when you are a researcher. It's just remembering to listen to what they're saying at all times. And I think that was particularly valuable where, and a lot of my work, I started very much working on quantitative measures, which just all about numbers. But by listening to what participants are saying, it turned out to be much more valuable, and it shifted a lot of my personal work. And I think that's really important because we still don't understand a lot of things about how technology works, how it can be at best adapted. And although some of the questionnaires and numbers are useful, it often needs to be complemented by listening to your participants and what they're saying. It seems like an obvious statement sometimes, but when you're a researcher, you often have so many things on your mind of what do you need to do, what you need to record. You forget the most obvious thing of what did the participants say? Did they find any concerns? Or did they enjoy the experience? And sometimes that in itself is very valuable and can shift a lot of perspectives. We found that a lot of autistic participants we had in the drawing tool task we did, they really enjoyed the task. It was really simple. We used OpenBrush, the easiest tool you can, and the most enjoyable. But because they had the headset on, it seems such a simple construct, but they can't see you. So some of the social pressure and difficulties are often removed. And that in itself was quite a powerful finding in my PhD. And it came only from observation and the discussions with the participant. Some of it might not even necessarily have been the most sort of formalized, but it ended up being quite powerful. And I think it has the potential to lead maybe to some more interesting work for me later on. But yeah, I think it's just listening, reflecting, and asking a lot of questions, because although we already know a lot about this technology, we still don't know enough. So just asking continuously is probably the best way to move forward. You might not need all of that information, but better have it and not need it, and need it and not have it.
Sure. And maybe the most important findings are in the participant habits, and so they won't explain them to you because for them it's normal. So I think to ask why do you do that again and again, to dig into their actions and to understand. So yeah, totally agree. And also it will help you maybe to overpass the confirmation bias, because when you just analyze the results and take them like this, you might be tempted to but it's a cognitive bias. I mean, it's just normal. People do that because you will associate those results to your hypothesis and say, okay, so this confirmed this and this, but maybe they're because you have built your experience based on your hypothesis. So it's normal. But if you try to observe the action and ask why and dig into this, you might be surprised by other results. Maybe you didn't think of, maybe they go further. So yeah.
Definitely. And I think sometimes not relying on language so much as well. I mean, working in neurodiversity, sometimes I guess you develop a sense that words cannot always express what participants want to say. And I think when they're often overwhelmed in XR, which happens, they might sometimes express themselves in a different way. It could be gestures, even like controllers. We know that a lot of participants struggle with this. It's just being observant as well. That can be very valuable. Sometimes words not always, it might not necessarily end up being a formal data collection, but it will inform future practice if you stay vigilant and observant, because sometimes participants will express things without words as well.
Also, maybe I was thinking of the people imaginary about XR because they are filled with sci-fi, with movies, with books about it. So if you ask directly what you need, what you're thinking of, they will probably answer based on those images of common imaginary fields. Yeah, so go further. I agree.
Thank you so much for
Thank you.
those. If there are no other questions, you can still type in some last questions if you have some. So maybe just wait a few minutes to make sure there are no burning questions left. But in the meantime, I just wanted to say thank you so much for this conversation, which was really, really interesting. I think we covered a lot of different aspects and dimensions of the topic. So it was great to have you.
Yes, it's a wide topic indeed. So but yeah, it was so valuable and so interesting all you say. So I hope it's also useful for the participants as well. But yeah, thank you so much and hope to have you again in another time.
Thank you so much for having us.
Mm.
It was very interesting.
Great. Well, then I think we'll finish now. So thank you again. And oh, 2 questions. Wait, no, don't leave. How many participants are enough when you think you have enough perspectives? And as you spoke on using observation and its value in gaining insights, how can we get such insights in a controlled data collection method?
Okay. So with enough participants, it's hard to answer, I think, depending on what kind of study you're doing. So I think when it comes to perspectives, I don't think there's ever such a thing as enough. There's always collect as much as you can. That's always say to my students as well.
Maybe about this one, what we usually do in Immersion is that it depends on whether you want a quantitative or qualitative analysis. If it's quantitative, I would say at least 20 to be able to carry some statistics analysis, but as many as you can have, the much is the better. And about the qualitative feedback, we usually find the same feedback, so at least some of them around 57 participants, I would say. So maybe try to target 5 participants, get the first results. It's likely that at this point you will have the same results approximately. So then you can make changes and then going back to look for users and feedbacks to proceed a lot of iteration like this. Maybe I would say 5, 6 can be enough from this perspective.
On the question as well, so the best decision to make is always look at previous literature, I think, because it could be from 2 to 10 for qualitative. It's very variable, I think. So and the second question I mentioned about observations. So this is a very good one because a lot of sometimes when you have a preset methods of how the data is collected, I think I see this a lot with some of the students that we have when you're conducting a short project. So you have a very set method and you're trying to do a lot. I think it's just being inquisitive. So what I sometimes recommend, and it's actually comes from the days when I did biology as an undergraduate. We used to have lab books where you record everything you do in the lab during the day. So it doesn't always necessarily end up in your final write-up or it's not part of your final experiment. but it's a useful almost lab diary that you keep. And I sometimes recommend this to students to do as well if you think you might be missing some important observations after you finish an experiment, if it is an experiment. Make sure you sit down and note down things that you might have noticed, because even if you have a controlled data collection methods, you are still dealing with people, so they will talk about things you might have not asked about. And in some cases, that information can be very valuable. So I think it's just finding a way to record it. It might not, like I said, be a formal data collection method, but it can inform your practice later on. So just the importance of staying reflective.
I agree with that.
Okay. So it looks like we have no more questions this time. So again, thank you. And as we were saying, the recording will be available. And we thank you so much to all participants for showing up and listening to this discussion. We really hope that it was as insightful for you as it was for us. And thank you again to our speakers, and maybe talk to you soon in the continuation of this project.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Sarune. Your work seems very interesting. I will have a look.
Yeah, I'll definitely do the same. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.